Period 5 is really important because it is kind of this, I guess it's the halfway point between what's going to be on the test, and it's really framed primarily by the Civil War. If you're going to think of one thing when you think about period 5, we're really talking about a period that revolves around the Civil War, the breaking apart of our country, and the fighting that's happening between the North and South. If you look at the years that frame period 5, it starts in 1844, which is important because we're talking about a significant growth in westward expansion. And then we're going to carry on all the way through 1877, which is important because that is the end of Reconstruction. That's when the North essentially abandons Reconstruction and decides to focus more on themselves. So those are the things that are framing this time period. But like I said, all of it is revolving around the Civil War. So what are the 3 stories that we absolutely have to know? They begin with this first story, which is westward expansion. And that is kind of what begins this unit. Okay, so when we talk about westward expansion starts in period 4. We already kind of talked a little bit about westward expansion. We talked about the growth of nationalism. If you remember, the ideas of manifest destiny were planted in period 4 of the Louisiana Purchase, with the clearing out of lands that had previously belonged to Native Americans. But now what's going to happen in period 5 is that desire for land is going to hit a high point. We're going to see the United States rapidly seek out opportunities to expand themselves, and we're going to see a migration of Americans further and further westward. So what are some of the events that kind of demonstrate this idea of manifest destiny? So manifest destiny is this belief that Americans are destined to expand from the East Coast to the West Coast. And there's a religious component to it. There's a lot of people believe that it's God that wants Americans to do this, but there's also a cultural component to it as well. Idea of manifest destiny just assumes that American culture is superior to other cultures around the world, because if God wants Americans to have this land, then by default it means that God doesn't want Native Americans or the Mexican people or other groups to have this land. So you kind of have to understand that there's a component of nationalism, a component of racial and cultural superiority, and then there's also an economic component where a lot of people want to just make money off of the land that we're gaining. So we see this in a number of different places. First, there is the annexation of Texas. Now, it's important to understand that Texas originally gained its independence in the 1830s, and that was not done by the United States. A group of Americans who had migrated into Mexico created their own revolution and then rebelled and asked to be annexed by the United States. The United States actually held off on annexation of Texas in the 1830s for fear that it would create like a conflict, not only with Mexico, but over the debate on slavery. When Polk becomes president, Polk is an expansionist, and he essentially pushes in the election to annex Texas. And the annexation of Texas obviously adds new territory to the United States, but it also then kind of sets off a series of events that lead us to the Mexican-American War. So Polk is not just interested in Texas. He's also interested in California. We attempt to buy California from Mexico. They're unwilling to sell it to the United States. And so essentially Polk picks a fight with Mexico in order to fight a war and hopefully gain that land. Now, at the exact same time that we are kind of seeing tensions grow between Mexico over California and the Mexican-American War, we also see Americans trying to push for land in Oregon. And so there's this slogan that was once again made by Polk, who was an expansionist president, a 54-40 or fight, and that we are willing to actually go to war with Great Britain in order to gain the territory of Oregon. All of this is part of this idea of westward expansion and of manifest destiny. And through these actions, we end up rapidly expanding the size of the United States. So Texas becomes a part of the United States. So is the Mexican Cession, which includes California, Arizona, New Mexico. And then, of course, there's also Oregon itself, which is, we don't gain all of it, but we agree to maybe a line that's a little lower than 54-40 or fight, which gives us our current territory of Oregon and Washington today. So all of this is part of these growing feelings of expansion. And we see Americans rushing into these new territories in order to take advantage of like the economic opportunities there. Probably the best example of this is the California Gold Rush, which happens right after the end of the Mexican-American War. In 1848, gold is discovered right outside of San Francisco at Sutter's Mill, and we have this flood of Americans into California to try to make it rich, okay? And of course, there's other people that are going to like fill in other areas of these new lands, but this migration westward is simultaneously happening as we're expanding our country. Now, why does this all matter to the time period? This matters because this is going to be a catalyst for the Civil War. As we expand our territory, as we get larger and larger, there becomes growing debate over slavery. Because as we add new territories, the inevitable question comes up: which of these territories will be free, and which of these territories will have slaves? And we see this almost immediately in this time period. So, when after the annexation of Texas, when the Mexican-American War breaks out, there's a declaration of war with Mexico, and there's a guy by the name of David Wilmot who proposes, as part of the declaration of war with Mexico, that we ban slavery in any new territory that would enter into the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War. This creates a firestorm of debate between pro-slavery states, which are in the South, and anti-slavery states, or states that don't want to see slavery expanded for a number of different reasons, in the North. And we're going to see these debates continue throughout this entire time period leading up to the Civil War. And so westward expansion directly links to debates over slavery. And that takes us to our second slide, a super important slide, and that is the Civil War. The Civil War, if there's, you have to know this. This is super important to our understanding of this time period. The Civil War is really the center of everything that's going on in period 5. And really, during this time period, we see a build-up to the Civil War, to our country deciding to actually break apart and fight each other. And the causes of the Civil War are somewhat complex. And so that's what I've created, actually, a color-coded slide here to help you understand what those major causes are. So we have to understand that the Civil War is not something that happens overnight. We've been building to this throughout history in the periods that have come before. And we start to see the factors that are leading to the Civil War become, I guess, more significant and become like more divisive in the years leading up to the outbreak of fighting, which is in 1861. So what are the things that take us directly towards the Civil War? There's a number of different things. First of all, there's debates over the expansion of slavery. Like in general, if we were to like if I was in a middle school class, we should know that slavery is one of the main causes of the Civil War. But what we have to do is, in an AP class, we have to break down that idea into like further parts. Slavery is affecting our country in a number of different ways. And one of the ways that slavery is affecting us is debates over where slavery will be. And so there's big arguments. The first reason for the Civil War is debates over whether where slavery should exist in the country and whether or not it should expand. So we see that in a number of things. Obviously, I already talked about the Wilmot Proviso. That's an example of that. But the free soil movement starts to emerge in the 1840s, and that also is something that is playing into this debate over the expansion of slavery. Free soilers don't want to eliminate slavery, but they want to kind of quarantine it. They want to make sure that slavery does not expand beyond its current boundaries. And so the idea is if they stop slavery from spreading to new lands, then maybe it'll die out on its own. The Compromise of 1850 was another debate over the expansion of slavery, whether California should be entered as a free state or a slave state. The Dred Scott decision, another event that deals with the debates over the expansion of slavery. Can the federal government limit where slavery can be? And in this case, by the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Supreme Court rules that the federal government does not have the power to stop the spread of slavery into territories. So it's incredibly divisive. And then there's the election of 1860. The Republican Party, which is formed in 1854, is a free soil party. Lincoln is not an abolitionist, but he doesn't want to see slavery expand. And so he takes an anti-slavery stance. And so the election of Lincoln in 1860 is viewed as a threat to the South because Lincoln has like free soil ideas, and so does the Republican Party. So that's one major cause of the Civil War. Another major cause of the Civil War is debates over the morality of slavery. If you go back to the Second Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening is important because it kind of changed the way that people viewed slavery. Slavery went from being an economic argument to whether it was a moral argument. Is it slavery a sin? And we start to see these debates over the morality of slavery intensifying in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, prior to this, obviously, there was the abolitionist movement had been created by William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass was very active in the abolitionist movement. David Walker, who you read last week, all of these were radical abolitionists. We see events that continue to build on that. So there's the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which opens the eyes of a lot of Americans to the horrors of slavery. Most Americans hadn't really didn't know much about slavery at this time period, and so this well-read book all of a sudden made people, not only in America but around the world, kind of become more aware of some of the horrors that existed within slavery itself, and made people feel that slavery was immoral. We see more abolitionist challenges to slavery. So there's the growth of the Underground Railroad after the Compromise of 1850 in direct response to the fugitive slave laws. The Southerners become more, at the same time, more entrenched in their position that slavery is not only necessary, but slavery is a positive good. John C. Calhoun argues that slavery is a positive good, and George Fitzhugh starts to argue that slavery is necessary for the South as well. And then probably one of the most important events during this time period that really divides the North and South is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, essentially goes into Virginia and tries to start a slave rebellion. And this, makes the South terrified of Northerners and Northern abolitionists, makes them more paranoid. But it also shows that the abolitionist movement is becoming more radical and willing to take more extreme steps to try to fight slavery. Our third reason is going to be failed compromises. In the build-up to the Civil War, it's becoming increasingly difficult for our government to try to reach compromises that would put off the slavery argument. So before this time period, there was the Missouri Compromise, and the Missouri Compromise had basically postponed the slavery issue for a long period of time by just drawing a line across the United States. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that. So there's the Compromise of 1850, which fails because it divides Americans even more. The Compromise of 1850 allows California to enter into the Union as a free state, but it also creates a tougher fugitive slave law that is hated by the North, and is something that makes a lot of Northerners opposed to this particular compromise. There's the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is a disaster. If you remember right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act used this concept of popular sovereignty to allow the Kansas-Nebraska territory to decide for themselves whether or not they would allow slavery or not. And this gave slavery the opportunity to expand north of the Missouri Compromise line. And that attempt to allow people to decide the slavery issue was a disaster. Slave owners and abolitionists move into the Kansas territory, and we have a situation called Bleeding Kansas emerge. in which we've got violence breaking out between the two sides. And then even in Congress, you see the debate with Charles Sumner, who is like an anti-abolition or anti-slavery advocate, being caned by Preston Brooks for speaking out against the South and speaking out against slavery. States' rights is also another major issue where you've got the issue of popular sovereignty. Who has more power, the federal government or states? So should states decide the slave issue, or should the federal government decide the slave issue? Democrats at this time period are going to argue for states' rights, and that like they should either have the right to keep slavery or like the people should be able to vote. That popular sovereignty is advocated by Stephen Douglas. John C. Calhoun argues that the states have the right to secede or nullify laws if they want. And this becomes the basis for the secession of the South, which begins with South Carolina after the election of 1860. Now, there are actually other causes of the Civil War, too, that you should know. Economic differences between the North and South play an important role, and that goes all the way back to the Market Revolution, with the South being a primarily agricultural economy based on cotton with slavery, and the North becoming more industrialized. There's also growing sectionalism, just like concerns about like the benefits of your region over the benefits of like the country as a whole. The election of 1860 is probably the best example of that, because in that election, like people aren't voting for national parties anymore. They're voting for parties from just like their region. For example, Lincoln wins the election in 1860 without carrying a single Southern state. In fact, he doesn't even appear on the ballot in a lot of Southern states. So this leads us to the Civil War, which is an incredibly important event that answers a lot of these questions that we've been building to. What is the power of the federal government? What will be the future of slavery in the United States? What will be the role of the government in the lives of the people? What will the economy look like of the United States moving forward? All of that is answered with the Civil War. And we'll continue to talk about that when we get into Reconstruction in a second, and then when we talk about Period 6. But as far as the Civil War is concerned, you should know a few things about it. You should know, obviously, who were the two sides. You know the Confederate States, which are the Southern states, and then you need to obviously know the Union, which is made up of the North. You need to know the steps the government's taking during the Civil War to change the role of the government and change the rights of the people. So you should know Abraham Lincoln, what he did during the Civil War. You should know a little bit about, obviously, so the things that he did to increase the power of the presidency, such as suspending the writ of habeas corpus, but he also took steps to gain more rights for African Americans and eliminate the institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was a important first step, and that'll eventually lead us into some of the Reconstruction amendments. So that's important to understand as well. It takes us to our last story, and this is the last thing I want to just run through. I know that I'm running out of time. If you have to leave, please, do not stay here if you have another class to go to, but if you have nowhere else to go, I'll just kind of finish this up for you guys. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the rebuilding of the nation. Reconstruction is our last story. And you do need to know Reconstruction, how the United States rebuilt after the Civil War was over. Because Reconstruction really has kind of two kind of parallel stories. There's the successes of Reconstruction, in which the North is rebuilding the country and kind of modernizing the South in a way that is more like where we are today. But at the same time, there are failures of Reconstruction. There's things that like the North does not address that leaves lingering inequalities in America. So let's kind of go through that. When we talk about Reconstruction, you don't need to know every single Reconstruction law. But what you do need to know is that there are phases. At first, like Lincoln had ideas. He was creating plans for what Reconstruction would look like. He wanted to be forgiving of the South. His plans obviously end with his assassination by John Wilkes Booth, which leads his vice president to take over. His vice president being Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, the wrong man for the job. He is a Southerner who doesn't believe in giving rights to African Americans. He's incredibly racist, and he conflicts quite a bit with the Republicans who are in Congress. So much so that they actually take control of Reconstruction from him, and that begins the process of what we call Congressional Reconstruction. Now, Congressional Reconstruction is important because congressional Reconstruction makes a lot of changes to the rights of African Americans, especially, and the role of government. So out of Reconstruction, we see a number of different important amendments that you have to know. So there's the Reconstruction Amendments, must know, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution. It gives citizenship to African Americans, but it also guarantees every person equal protection under under our laws. So the federal government is now becoming the protectors of individual rights. And then there's the 15th Amendment, which gives all men universal male suffrage, and that's important. So it gives African American men the right to vote, but women are left out of that amendment, which is obviously going to continue to create a split, so that women are going to become even more like stronger advocates for their own suffrage in period 6 into period 7. We got the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is important because now the federal government is taking a role in trying to provide welfare for people after the Civil War. So what they begin to do is they provide like food, they provide shelter, and most importantly, they start to provide education for freed African Americans after the war is over. But it's not just African Americans that benefit from the Freedmen's Bureau. There are a lot of white Southerners who benefit from that as well. Unfortunately, despite these gains, and there are a lot of gains, African Americans gain more political power. They obviously gain their freedom. They're granted citizenship, and we start to see African Americans serving in state and federal government in this time following the Civil War. But there are also failures as well because of Reconstruction. So some of the failures are, number one, Reconstruction really never addresses the economic needs of former slaves. So essentially slavery is replaced with something called sharecropping, where African Americans are essentially become tenant farmers for their former plantation owners in some cases, because they don't have a lot of education, because they don't have savings, and the federal government doesn't provide those things for them. They're forced to do agricultural jobs for other people who own land. All right, and this becomes a cycle of poverty that exists through this era and into period 6 and even parts of period 7. There's also an incredible backlash from the South against some of the rights that African Americans were gaining. So at first, right after the Civil War ends and you've got the 13th Amendment passed, you've got something called the Black Codes, which attempts to establish slavery only under a different name. And that was an attempt to kind of reestablish slavery. It's eliminated by the 14th Amendment, but it shows Southern resistance almost immediately to Reconstruction. We see the rise of violent groups that attempt to keep African Americans from exercising their rights. One of the best examples of that is the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, which was made up at first of ex-Confederate soldiers. And then there's an attempt to strip African Americans of their political rights. By 1877, as the Reconstruction comes to an end, the North pulls out of the South, and then the South begins to gain back control over their own laws and their own rules. And what ends up happening is, as these like redeemers or Southern Democrats come to power, they strip African Americans of a lot of the rights that they had gained. A good example of that is the creation of literacy tests, the creation of poll taxes in order to keep them from voting. Then eventually there's the Jim Crow laws that are put in the era of called the New South, and those Jim Crow laws establish segregation. So this is essentially period 5 in a nutshell.